Well, hello, good morning and good afternoon. We are going to give it just a few more seconds to make sure everyone is in the room. We're so glad to have you. We're excited to have you. It's been already an interesting morning with our technology, but we're here. We are here. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and just get started. We appreciate you for being here. Today's webinar, we look for it to be a very rich experience, and our topic today is recognizing and honoring and evaluating students and educators, and really around valuing each other. So we're so glad to have you. I am Kamilah Antoine. I'm a Harmony Professional Learning Specialist. I've been with Harmony for a little under a year, but super excited to be here. I'm going to be your moderator and kind of hosting our conversation with our two professionals that we are having here with us today. So in our monthly webinar series, we want to share some best practices and tools that support social and emotional learning. The presentations that we do during this webinar series, this content and the opinions of the guest speakers may not necessarily represent Harmony directly, so we want to be very clear about that. Also, in viewing this webinar, we encourage you to mute your additional screens that you may have up. We know the world of multitasking and how we can sometimes be working on multiple things, but for your best experience, we really hope that you can lean into this dialogue. Use the question box that's there to pose questions for our speakers today, and you can use the control panel also for comments and things like that. Also, as a reminder, this is being recorded, so if you do need to pop out or if you want to watch this at a later date, you will have that opportunity. And if you do watch live and watch it in its entirety, you will receive a certificate from the GoToWebinar within the next week or so, so be on the lookout for that. And you'll also be able to have a download copy of our slide deck today. All right, so if you are not familiar with Harmony Academy, welcome. Harmony Academy is designed to be sort of a two-prong approach. We have our Harmony curriculum, which encompasses a full scope of activities, storybooks, lessons, quick engagement activities, all around student engagement. Our primary curriculum is from pre-K through 6, with our everyday practices supporting students all the way through high school. On the other side, we also have what we call our Harmony Professional Learning. This is a program that focuses on our educators and making sure that our educators have all that they need for their own well-being, as well as to equip them to be the best professionals that they can be, which is really inspired by our whole human education here at National University. Today's objectives, what are we here for today? So we want you to walk away with two things, right? We want you to understand how to build educational communities that support the whole you, as the significance of well-being for all students, as well as walking away with learning some strategies that can promote a more empathetic classroom and encourage the consideration of multiple perspectives. So we have a poll that I believe one of my colleagues is going to launch, which should have just launched. And we want you to take some opportunity to answer the poll question. Now, I can't see the responses to our poll question, but if someone could put those in the chat for me, that would be helpful. But if not, we'll make sure we come back to it before the end. We just love technology, right? It always is so awesome.
Kamilah,
Yes.
we have 41% of our folks in the virtual room that are K-12 educators and 12% K-12 administrators, and then 47% other.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's cool. Thank you. Thank you for that, Dr. Schneider. I was wondering, so about half of the room, I know that's helpful, right? About half of the room represent our K-12. The other half is going to be other. That is really, really fun and interesting to hear. Well, I'm glad whatever brought you here. I'm so glad that you are here. And we have two dynamic speakers that I want to make sure that we give a due introduction for. And although you can't see her on screen right now, she is here. We promise she is here.
I
Um,
am.
it is my honor to introduce our both of our distinguished panelists today, Vice President of Culture and Community Outreach, Emily Esparza. Emily is a Silicon Valley native and first-generation college student. She champions educational equity and culturally rich programs for thriving communities. As the VP of Culture and Community Outreach at National University, she leads the Social Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Council, fostering an inclusive and innovative university vision. Emily's accolades include the 2023 Hochstadt Wilcox Institutional Award, as well as the 2022 NAACP Innovative Education Award. Recognized for her impact, she serves on the San Jose KNTV Hispanic Advisory Board, and she chairs the inaugural San Jose State Student Day. A leadership fellow for HOPE and HFSV. Emily holds a bachelor's degree and multiple certifications pursuing graduate studies in consciousness and transformational leadership. What a huge honor to have her on our panel today. Joining us as well is the Director of Secondary Instruction at Highline Public Schools in Seattle, Washington, Dr. Laura Schneider. Dr. Schneider is an equity-driven educational leader, consultant, and author with proven expertise in research, strategic systems, design, and professional learning, with the facilitation for transformative impact. To get our conversation going, I'm going to have both of them share just a little bit about their background and maybe some of the recent work that relates to our topic today. So I believe we're going to start off with Emily in sharing some of her work.
Thank you so much, Kamilah. And again, thank you, Technology Spirits, to continue to partner with us to the end of this, this webinar. And it's an absolute pleasure to be here and to be supporting our community. In K through 12, it looks like 41%, 47% other. But overall, whatever role you hold in education, we're really here to serve our community, right? We're here to strengthen and empower, and as the webinar says, elevate our community. And even more so, I am honored to be part of the social and emotional learning movement and charter, and I am a huge fan, and it's an honor to be always partnering with Harmony Academy and the body of work they do. So thank you for having me here today, and I'm excited to share a bit of experience and observations and I'm going to say pilots and findings that we have found, and if they resonate, I hope they help your community. So the first thing that I think that Kamilah shared is, I am first generation. I'm a first generation that was around before English as a second language, before ESL was around. So I didn't, even though I'm born here uniquely, I didn't learn English until I was 10 years old. That's how strong my community was in the region that I habitated. Is we had a strong community where English was not a need. My culture and my practices were very much my Mexican roots. And just to have K through 12 education was already a challenge, let alone even thinking of higher education, which brought even more barriers and more challenges and cultural norms. So having firsthand lived through that, there's a huge level of empathy I have for fellow students who are on that charge. And that's before we add the tension that we have now as a nation, that vary region to region. And that's before we had many of the incidents, unfortunately, that have taken place. over the last decade that have really put social justice on the front lens. And with that said, I'm going to start my formal introduction, which is, unfortunately, in 2020, we had the incident of the George Floyd murders. And as an institution, our educators, our leadership, our students, and our board said, what can we do? What can we do differently? And what can we do to serve better the communities we serve? And they brought forth our inaugural Office of Social Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And I was honored enough to be one of the first members of this office. And the charter of this office was to bring education, to bring training, and to bring elevated representation in the cultural communities that we served. And we had leadership that was supportive. We had leadership that was interested. And so next for us was, how do we start building on that as far as a framework, as far as a structure? And then how do we look at sustaining that? Because social justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, it looks different decade to decade. If I were to use those words 40 years ago, we'd be using different language. 30 years ago, even in the last 5 years, it's organic. And so I think it's important to note that it's not today is the solve all. Today is, what are some practices that we can remain current and keep elevating and expanding in how we serve our community. So the Office of SJEDI for the past 2 years did quite a few pilots. Oh, I'm sorry, can you stay back just for a second, Kamilah? Sorry, my apologies. No. So the Office of SJEDI was the background of how we came to be. And after a couple years and a bit of transformation and leadership within our university, we looked at how can we do better. And what we came up with was, rather than having an office of 4, which in some institutions and organizations is an office of 1, and my heart goes out to those because I know you're out there. But if we can do differently than an office of 1 or 4, can we be much more intentional in that we want to include our entire faculty, staff, and community at large? And we created what's called the SJEDI Council. And the SJEDI Council is comprised of 4 officers, of which I am one, and honored to serve with 3 other experts that are advocates in the social justice realm, and 34 delegates. Way too small to see here, but the important point is the 34 delegates is a hybrid of those that were nominated to advance inclusion and those that actually stepped forward and said, I want to make a change, and they were the at-large part. So we have now a representation of all of our schools, our business units, really elevating and encompassing those diverse voices at all levels, to advance our charter. Now the next slide. And how we're doing it is we're instituting what's called the Inclusive Excellence Framework. For those of you who are not familiar with the Inclusive Excellence Framework, it's really the leading edge strategy on how in your organization, whether it's elementary school, middle school, or a university, how do you end to end really look at all the components of what makes your organization, and how do you become intentional and strategic in making sure your SJEDI lens, social justice lens, applies to all facets. And I'll go to the next slide, Kamilah. And then once you start securing leadership buy-in, and once you identify the framework or strategy that you want to institute, how do you sustain it? And so sustaining this, you want to become to a point where it's not a new thing, it's not an exceptional thing, it's a foundational operation. It's a core lens to everything that you do within your organization. And then here I've just shared a few of our pilots that really took a hold and have been growing. We came up with, Zoom backgrounds. We've profiled some of our leaders that are really advocating for our different communities. We do celebrations. This is just, a short collage, if you will, of some of the efforts that we've done. But the crux here is that once we do that framework and we sustain it, we want to make sure that they become policy and a practice. They're evergreen, right? So that if we move or there's any changes, these stay with the organization. And I'll stay there because I think those are the 3 main themes, which is, leadership buy-in, what's the framework and structure, and then how do you sustain? How do you continually practice and empower your community to keep elevating voices?
Thank you.
Thanks,
so
Kamilah.
much, Emily. No problem. I can hear your passion and everything that you share. And so we certainly appreciate the explanation of where the work is going and that you're leading. Next, we'll have Dr. Schneider, who's going to share a little bit about some of the current work and background that she represents.
Thank you so much, Emily. I wish we could see your face because great time having conversations about all of this just in preparation for today. But the context that you shared is so critical and so valuable. And I wanted to mention, I'll share an example of the work that I've been leading in both Seattle Public Schools, where I was for 9 years, and now currently in Highline Public Schools. And I wanted to just name that work was possible because the school district had racial equity policy, practices. There were racial equity teams. We had a Department of Racial Equity Advancement and a Center for Education, or Center for Racial Equity, sorry, through the union. And so there was institutional support and structures for the work that I'll describe. And, I think we're in, I appreciate you naming the George Floyd moment as a moment to really focus on, and when equity came to the forefront. And so I think we'll be able to talk to kind of how that work is shifted over time. So I'll start by describing the culture responsive teacher leadership cadre work that I led in Seattle. And this was prior to, right up to the beginning of 2020, before school closures. And the goals of this work, specifically in partnership with the Department of Racial Equity Advancement and the Center for Racial Equity, was to develop communities of practice that would create, sustain, and grow culturally responsive teaching practices to improve learning experiences of students of color. And in Seattle, our disproportionality data reflected that we weren't really meeting the needs well of a lot of students of color. So there was disproportionality data that pointed to that, academic outcome data, student survey data, and the efforts of the system were to, in terms of policy and structures, were to focus on that. But this was sort of a next level down in the educational ecosystem. How do we get that to transpire differently in the classroom for students? So these communities of practice that we built, I'll describe them briefly, but we developed and used particular tools, resources, and structures to foster systems of culturally responsive practice and to use community as a driver for that. So we were trying to think about equity by design through adult learning communities that impacted student learning in the classroom. Next slide, please. So here's kind of an overarching theoretical frame and theory of action. And I really like Deborah Ball's description here of the complexity of the work of teaching if we're talking about creating communities where students feel their identities and voices are valued, and also where there's identity safety. She said, teaching is dense with discretionary spaces. Given that through those discretionary spaces, that is exactly the way in which racism, sexism, and other forms of bias and oppression can come in through the permeable boundary of teaching, what does that mean for our work? So the design of these structures was to start with teacher communities of practice as a lever for changing both educator culture and practice, but classroom experience for students. And to create environments where adults could take risks, be vulnerable, and really be able to better recognize what kids were experiencing in the classroom that we were trying to shift. And so in service of that sort of middle circle there, we used racial equity analysis the district had a racial equity analysis tool that was applied to policies and practices. We also brought that into how do we start to see problems of practice around equity in the classroom. And teachers developed inquiries built out of their own classrooms around what they were seeing and wondering about with student learning, and how did that impact or relate to their teacher practice. And so they would work together as a community. Each educator had an inquiry focused on an equity issue in their classroom, and they would do sort of collaborative action research and inquiry together to support one another in making shifts in their classroom. And the goal there at the center was that impacting those discretionary moments. It's okay, I got it.
I wasn't sure if you were already talking about this because I was like visualizing it as you were talking about it.
Yeah, so this is just an image of what that work looks like as a cycle of adult learning. Educators would bring their problem student learning. An example of that is the very first group that we ran. There were 8 to 10 educators that taught various subject areas. They were racially, linguistically diverse group of educators. They all wanted to work on this aspect of their practice, and we wanted to support their leadership development. And so the first problem of student learning we looked at was a white middle school teacher in Seattle who was a language arts teacher. And she was saying, you know, I'm trying to address social justice issues in my classroom, but my kids aren't talking very much. I feel like I'm not hearing very much student voice, and I'm not sure what's going on with that. And the majority of her students in her classroom were students of color. So she sort of zeroed in on a problem of teaching practice around how to build a culture that was more eliciting of student voice. And as a team, the whole group went in, watched her observe a lesson. We collected observation data on different aspects of the classroom and dynamics. And then we brought that observation data back together, debriefed that. And, you know, one of the things that came forward and then became sort of a focus for the whole group was the notion that kids weren't given enough opportunities and scaffolding. Like we wanted student voice, but there was not enough room for it, right? Educators needed to sort of step back and give students more agency in the classroom. And so they came together around figuring out how to do that. We also gathered student input. So as the work went on, we developed more surveys and exit tickets and student interviews and things so kids could tell us, you know, how does it feel to be in this classroom? Do you feel safe enough to take risks? You know, what's happening here? And a lot of times there were really racial and socio-cultural dynamics going on in the classroom that teachers couldn't always see in their own classroom. And so having us together as a community to look at that, and then having the vulnerability to really, and the safety as adults to honestly talk about, like, here's what I saw, was at times challenging for folks, but really powerful in terms of the shifts that they made in instruction and the changes that they saw for the students that they were trying to impact. So the last piece I'll say about that is we then had teacher leaders helping to build professional learning for other educators and sharing their journey of making sense of their classroom dynamics and what practices they put in place. And that was a really powerful model for teacher professional learning, because not only were they learning, you know, strategies and so forth, but people shared their actual story of what they had to learn to recognize as educators in order to make those shifts. And that transparency and vulnerability and the recognition that it's an ongoing process was really impactful just in the work. So that's what I'll say about that for now, and we can dig in more later.
Thank you.
Can I Can I jump in, Kamilah? Yeah, Laura, I just want to, I want to say thank you for sharing that both illustration, because it is a cycle, right? I think it speaks to what we talked about, sustainability. It's iterative, right? That might be the situation in a classroom, in one district, in one organization, and it's constantly moving, it's constantly evolving, and the variables are changing, right? It's very dynamic. So I really appreciate you sharing the cycle, and I also appreciate you sharing, both from a gratitude for the leadership that enables you to do and impact change, along with the community of educators that are being courageous in being vulnerable, in sharing their story, in being also, I think, vulnerable in listening, in listening to stories that are being shared to create that safe space. So just, it's inspiring to hear that. And I thank you for sharing.
No problem. Such great illustration and examples to share. So I have we're going to open up and just keep this conversation going, our official fireside chat. But I'll pose my first question to you, Dr. Schneider, as a leader in a large district, a large urban district to be specific. What are some of the broad challenges that you've seen more recently that educators and leadership face to create cultures where students feel valued? I know you gave us a great example with the teacher that was that language arts teacher, but since COVID has kind of still not passed, but right, we're on the other side of it, have you noticed any challenges that are still being faced around student being valued?
Yeah, I mean, so the work that I described is sort of the ideal model of how we were trying to lift those communities and create an ecosystem around culture and cycles of learning. COVID had a pretty big impact in terms of, not only could you not physically visit someone's classroom, but trying to observe what's happening with students dynamically in virtual space is very hard. Although we did have some educators that during that time period, some of our teacher leaders, we sort of brought together to say, like, what does it mean to do culturally responsive practice virtually? Can we look at that together? So they did actually record their lessons, and we shared those and did some kind of investigation of that and trying to leverage, the context that we were in. I think the biggest challenge now, and now that I'm in Highline, which is just a little bit south of Seattle Public School District, is this work takes time. It takes time to build community, to create communities where there's vulnerability. You need time and space to be able to be in each other's physical classrooms. And time is really challenging to get with teachers right now. We have limitations on availability of subs, so a lot of work gets pushed after the school day. It's harder to get time commitment that we could more easily get when it was built into the school day. And I think the need is even greater, right? Because more and more we hear from educators right now that, student engagement, student voice is critical. And there are a lot of struggles with students coming back from COVID and knowing how to create those spaces that foster the same quality of experience that we're trying to get. So the need is greater. Our time with educators and the availability of time as a resource is a barrier for sure. There's definitely commitment and will, and it's a pretty broadly shared problem of practice. But I still really believe we need the capacity to bring folks together in community to work on those things, that it's very difficult to try to do all of that in isolation. So I'd say that's kind of the biggest challenge.
Yeah, that I've heard that as well. Time is so precious right now. Emily, same question to you, but I guess from a university perspective and working in university, what are some of the broad challenges that you all have faced? Are they similar or different to what Dr. Schneider has shared?
No, absolutely. I think building on what Dr. Schneider shared is, I think we're all in the same boat, if you will, right? We're all constrained to 24 hours in a day. We're all constrained to the systems and the structures that we support, but they've become a little bit more complex, right? They come certainly before, I think, COVID. To be honest, I think they were already complex, right? Then we had COVID, and now we have post-COVID, right? The remnants of COVID, and the isolation, the silos. I think when you look at leadership, we're looking to support our students first, our faculty first, our administration first, and our community at large first, right? So they're all imperative for us. And then when you add the element of culturally rich mindedness or practices, that's an additional element now, right? And that's before we add, and again, I'm going to be gentle about this, but I think it's important, is the tension of different philosophies, right? And the different values that are arising across our nation. And so by no means, I think, is it one answer answers all, but what I think is important is, what are some of the elements that we can look at, right? And so I think when you're talking about culturally rich practices and communities that serve other communities, is you have to be educated and trained and aware of those cultural practices. So one thing that we did here as a university, and I'll absolutely thank our board and our president, Dr. Mark Milliron, that he has brought in this social justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion lens across our strategy and everything that we do. It's been a very intentional declaration, and it's something that holds huge accountability with both our faculty and staff. So what does that mean? It means that we are being intentional at every point that we touch. And what does that mean? It means, for example, we are a Hispanic serving institution. 34% in our, mind you, our fastest growing demographic is the Hispanic community. We're also a minority serving institution, all right? We're also military serving institution. Those demographics already, and we're in various regions in the United States, add to a very interesting, complexity. But what we're focusing on is what unites us, right? What brings us together? What brings us cohesively and aligned? And that is that we value every student where they're at, and it's a bit different. So we have been intentional in partnering, for example, with our marketing team that really starts to represent in media, in images, in promotions, in announcements, in flyers, the various colors, the various representations of faces of those that we serve, to really be intentional and purposeful, that students see themselves in our organization. Equal to that, we also know that these communities learn best when they're learning for those who have similar lived experiences or look like them as well. And so there's a mindfulness to increase the representation at leadership and faculty level to support those the students that we have. The other part that I think we've been intentional about is, and this is something that came out of the Office of Jedi, is we did a few pilots. And one of those pilots, for example, is this work. It's hard. It takes a lot of energy. It just does, right? So then how can we provide support, right? How can we provide support? So we have a whole person center that provides meditation, that provides, yoga, that provides, breathing exercises, that provides ways to do your role and just take respite, if you will, so that we can, continually restore, right, ourselves. And I think that's very important across our organization. And lastly, we also started building communities. The two communities that I'll speak to is our employee resource groups. And those were communities and clusters of like-identified communities that started to talk a little bit more intentionally about the challenges they're having and how they support each other. And some are a little bit more, I'm going to say, some are larger than others, but each of them, and I think we started with 3, we piloted 3, an LGBTQ group, we did a women's group, and we did a Latino group. Now we have 12. Now we have 12 that are led by our various organizations that bring in speakers to, bring in some knowledge, bring in our whole person center to say, let's all take a breath together, right? But they're unifiers. And then we also did that on the student side. So we also have student groups that now are gathering together to support each other and to elevate each other. And so I think there's maybe a few practices that I can share with you that that I think are important when you're bringing this cultural lens, And when we have job descriptions, that's part of our job description too, that this is an intent, right? Social justice is something we value in this organization. When you're onboarded, you're trained in social justice. And even in our reviews, if you will, there's a component there on how are you advancing inclusion. So I think there's ways that you can weave in, not adding on, but weave into what exists. And you can start small, like Dr. Schneider said, shared, right? We have to start where we're at in every organization, every district, right? Every teacher's at a different point, and whatever point that is, that's okay. Let's add an element. Let's include an element, and then collectively, if we all add elements, right? Then we have a really nice impact, and it keeps growing. So I think those are maybe some things that I could share that we've done, and that I would think might be helpful to various districts.
That's a good point. I'm glad that you brought that up. When you mentioned the employee resource groups and the student groups, it really reminds me, because of how much I work with the Harmony curriculum and our meetup practices, those everyday practices, although a student population in the classroom may have lots of diversity, it's going to be great to do those meetups, or to do that circle time, or to do that intentional time to community build, because when you're working with larger organizations, making those small connections in those circles are where it starts, right? And like you said, starting somewhere, starting at a place where student voice can be amplified, and we can give them the confidence to share who they are and to be accepting of one another. It usually is going to start with those smaller subgroups. So that really makes me think of Meetup. Dr. Schneider, and the fact that we are running short on time, but I also want to give some voice to K-12, since I know we do have kind of a 50-50 audience here. Can you share any specific stories or initiatives from your district that you currently work for, or maybe previous districts, where there was an improved sense of value and inclusivity amongst the students and teachers?
Yeah, so again, I feel it's really important to stress that we want to support and build capacity with our educators, and that when they feel there's permission to learn and lean into these things that are hard, they're more willing to go the extra distance, and more willing to rely on each other. So we had a lot of positive growth feedback from the Culture Responsive Teacher Leader Project. We're currently doing that in Highline as well, although it's just kind of getting rolling this year, and we've had shorter amounts of time with educators, but people are really invested around the things that they care about, and when people bring their equity problems of practice, it's because they want to do right by their students, right? And so centering around what matters to folks, but also being intentional about, we're here to do equity work together, and that's going to be challenging. And while we want to make sure we're creating multiple kinds of spaces for different identities and voices, we also really need to have space where we can be together as a collective and be able to learn how to have hard conversations across our differences to move the work forward. And so just those opportunities the teachers are having have been a lot of powerful feedback from teachers that they really value being in a space that's intentionally for that purpose. The norms that we have in place, the shared vision around the work that gets built is critical. And in terms of student data, we're trying to look at more intentionally this time around, and still very early, but there's a lot more availability of student voice data collected kind of system-wide. So in Highline, one of the focus areas we have as a district is to really improve students' sense of belonging. And we have student feedback data that shows us where that's at, and we're working to track that over time and see, how is that shifting. We're also trying to do more sort of street data practices with students. So teachers have used sort of a common just even exit ticket, doesn't even have to be digital, but it can be. And it asks kids just a series of questions at the end of a lesson, right? How challenging was the work you were doing today? Did you feel like you understood what you were being asked to do? Did you feel safe enough to take a risk and try in this classroom? And did you feel like what you're learning is relevant? So those are some of the recurring questions. And so teachers have been within PLCs and various spaces kind of looking at that within their own classroom space over time, because I think that's an important indicator of, are we moving the needle? So, when they get those responses back from kids and kids are saying, I don't like talking in this classroom because when I'm in my group, nobody listens to me. That's really critical data, and it means, okay, there's some things I can do as an educator to impact that. So we're in the process of building more systems around measuring that impact, but in the Highline work, because we've only been starting for the last maybe 9 months or so, it's still early, but those would be some ways we're trying to look at that.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. If we were to, and this question, I guess, is for both of you as we kind of wrap up the fireside chat portion of our conversation. If we were to ask for some practical strategies that educators, administrators, those that work with students, that they could actually use or apply to help encourage and increase the value that students feel in the school setting, what one or two strategies? I love the exit ticket strategy that you go with those key questions. That was like perfect. Would you add any additional strategies? And then obviously to Emily as well, I would love to hear any brief strategies that could help.
Yeah, I think great question. And I think building on what Dr. Schneider just shared, I mean, collectively, if you're part of any organization, you want to hold a shared vision, right? And I think she used the reference leaning in, right? We have a group of educators, teachers, administrators that really are leaning into a specific community to support our students at large. And I think what's important in that shared vision is you need to be explicit. Mm-hmm. It needs to be intentionally explicit and clear. And it needs to be driven by action or accountability or participation or engagement. You need to see it in action. So I think when we look at a strategy, if we're looking at a collaborative strategy, which is phenomenal, what is the end result? And let's write it down so that we all agree. So I think it's very important, explicit, and whether you call it a vision, a declaration, a mission, a North Star, right? However you categorize it, a statement of cause, right? A statement of calling, but it has to be explicit because that's the unifier. And then after the unifier, I think it's important is, which again, Dr. Schneider did a beautiful job, is, how do you measure the impact, right? Is it working? Is it impacting in the way you thought, at the speed you thought, with the capacity you have? Is it moving in the right direction? I mean, even if they're small steps, but they're absolutely critical that, when you do have an alignment and you do have an explicit charter, then how is it practicing in motion? And these could be, for example, if you have a mission or vision or a declaration, what are the values that then kind of support? And the values could be embodied practices or philosophical practices, right? But that's what starts building the culture of a belonging. That's what starts building the culture of safety, the culture of building trust, the culture, which, for example, are our ways of working. We have 5 ways of working, and we're pretty explicit on it. And we have 5, and I'll share them with you real quick. Number 1 for us is championing student success. It's the core of everything we do. Number 2, we want to continually build trust. Number 3, we always want to advance inclusion. Number 4, embrace accountability. And number 5, the final one, making things better. What does that mean to your organization, to your community? And whatever point you're at, it's buildable. So I think that's what I would add is whatever the charter is, make it explicit, supported in either values or actions that are seen, heard, felt, and then measure them. Like, how are we doing, right? To make sure that we're still connected to the communities that we serve.
Thank you. Dr. Schneider, would you add anything else?
Yeah, and I just noticed a question in the chat. Someone who's at a school with 80% neurodiverse and nearly 50% choice exceptional, and strategies for that population. And my response to that is to kind of build on something that that Emily was just saying about being explicit and intentional. So my work grew out of my dissertation research, which is shared in my book. And one of my chapters is about how we build better classroom communities for student voice. And really the premise is exactly what Emily was saying. You can't just expect kids to become a different kind of community than they are presently unless you explicitly teach toward the vision of what that looks like, and then give them tools, and then give them feedback, right? So we have to be willing to say, here's what it looks like and sounds like when we can learn together in this way. And I've worked with, in my own classroom, and then with really brilliant educators who've done this as well. And you have to have those success criteria, and then you have to be able to give kids as a community feedback. Where are we at in terms of getting to what we're trying to get our community to look like? What do we need to work on? And I think sometimes with, gifted students in particular, one of the things that we deal with in a classroom is every kid's bringing in their prior experience of what they think they're supposed to do in school and what classroom environment is supposed to look like, and then therefore what they're supposed to say or do or not say or do. And sometimes our students, who can be high performing, have a really difficult time being vulnerable or being in, even engaging sometimes in higher level discussion with others, because they're used to being rewarded for a certain kind of performance that's much more individualistic and not collectivist. And so they need that explicitness as well, right? Here's what's being valued in this space. And again, that comes back to group norms and having kids give input around group norms, and then giving them feedback on how is our classroom working or not working. And that all kind of comes back to those individual exit tickets. So as a teacher, you can, you're teaching the environment, you're teaching the culture, but it doesn't just happen because you do one lesson or have a chart on the wall. It's also a process that takes time, but I've seen really powerful things happen when teachers do that. And if I could share one more quick example from our teacher leader cadre, after the middle school teacher who shared her problem practice, one of our kindergarten teachers that was in the same group of teacher leaders, she said, you know what? My kindergartners can do this. I've been doing too much of the work. I'm going to try to get them to run their own discussions about their books. And so we went in and observed. Her school is in Southeast Seattle. She'd been an educator for 25 plus years, really amazing Black educator, had great rapport with her students, strong teacher. But what she did in that one lesson that we observed is she explicitly taught her kindergarten, here's what I want to see you do, and I want you to do more of the talking, and here's what it looks like and sounds like. So when we're practicing today, here's what I want you to do. And when she was explicit, all of a sudden, every kid was engaged in helping, share during the lesson. So can't really underestimate how powerful that is, that we have the vision and that kids know what it is and how to get there. So in the K-12 context.
I love that. I love that. Everything that you were saying, I was actually taking notes here, and it made me think of, again, not to go back to what I said earlier, but to go back to what I said earlier, the meetup. When Emily said explicit, it made me think about the Harmony Goals process. And in the Harmony Academy and the curriculum, there's a portion or an activity that we encourage teachers to do on a daily basis with their class. But to start that process is sitting down and having an explicit conversation about what do we want our classroom to feel like? How do we want to feel in our class? What do we want this space to be like? And even posing that question to kindergartners or first grade students, you may word it a little bit differently, but it starts with everybody coming together as a community and having conversation around creating some harmony goals, right? Those norms, not your class rules, not do this, not that, but it's more where do we want our class to be? And then through the meetup being done on a regular basis, there's constant opportunity to assess and to monitor, and for the students to then say, well, I thought we weren't going to tease about hair. The other day, there was some teasing about hair, right? So whatever they may put in their goals, and they don't come from the teacher, they're really generated from the student teacher facilitated and synthesized. However, what it does is allow students to kind of self-assess and monitor, and then you also can be able to measure how that's going and when things when goals are being met, and hey, we're going to focus on something else as a class. And when that's done a little bit every day, over time, it sticks and it creates an opportunity in a space where, whether we're doing math or whether we're talking about our harmony goals or whether we're in the middle of a science project, every voice has value and everybody's accountable to each other within the community. So really, really love the ideas that you guys have thrown out. I just want to also bring light to, I don't know if this was a question or maybe a comment, but there was a question that came through. It says, I think some schools tend to ignore the power of working together with parents and create community with them involved. The parent is a potent tool. Yes, or potent tools. So yes, I would agree as well. And with that, as I kind of guide us through the wrap up here, I will also say that in our Harmony Academy, we really have a home to school connections that really draws the parent in and allows for parents to also have some practical tips and strategies and things that they can do at home with their students that will also support this work. So definitely not leaving out the parent element of what we're doing. So as we very quickly wrap up, any last very brief, if I gave you 30 to 45 seconds, Dr. Schneider, any last minute messages or takeaways that you would love for our audience to take?
Yeah, I just again, that closing thought of, if we want to achieve equity in this work, we have to be intentional, and we have to be willing to dig in with each other, to create adult spaces for hard conversations and really nurture that to the point that you were just making, that it's built over time, and we have to continually collectively check in. Are we going in the right direction? Is this working for everyone? Are there problems we need to, put in the middle of our time together so that we can work through them, so that we can continue to thrive together? And I really appreciate, Emily, everything you're bringing to the table around creating, context and structures, and also just what you mentioned at the beginning, that we continue to be in challenging times where having those kind of conversations with each other and being able to continue to work on equity and make impacts around that requires us to do things that are hard.
Yes.
And so, we need each other for that. We need to, value and uplift and be together in order to do that. So just appreciate the time to talk about this and the willingness to keep moving forward on the work that was really came out of, not came out of, but was highlighted during the pandemic, but we want to make sure is sustained.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Emily, I'll throw that same question to you. If you could do a 30 to 45 second or so wrap up on things that you want to just give as that takeaway.
Thank you, Kamilah. No, I agree with everything that Dr. Schneider shared. And I also agree with her statement that it takes time. It's not easy. And I think what I would add is that all the changes that are made, they're done collaboratively. They are done in community. So you're not doing anything you do in a silo or singularly. Whatever we are doing, we're going to be doing with other people, with other communities, with other administrators, other educators, other leaders, right? So I think the body of work that we're doing in the social justice realm, and even with, you know, I'm going to say social justice realm because it seems to be a lot of the challenges are coming up in that specific area as of recent, but these hard conversations, whether they're with parents, whether they're with, again, you know, other community leaders or administration, know that whatever you're doing it in community or you're doing it collaboratively. And the more collaboratively you become, I think that starts building a muscle of, and I think Dr. Schneider referred this to, it's a collective body of learning. I mean, it can act from something that's very difficult or something that's unprecedented. It's an opportunity for growth. So I think in collaboration, there can be the opportunity for growth. There can be an opportunity for education and to better fuel and support the communities that we serve and the students that we serve. And the last item that I would say, you know, beyond collaboration and always an opportunity for growth and impact is that it's iterative, right? It's organic. So these conversations, these incidents, these tensions, we know what we know today. Stay tuned for March. Stay tuned for 2026. Who knows what's going to bring? It's just going to continue, and it might change. So I think it's very important to be grounded in your own values, grounded that those values align with the organizations that you are part of, and then grounded in knowing that you are in community in anything that you are challenged with, that there are other community members that can come to your aid, and that we're all in this together. I think that's for me kind of my North Star, that whatever challenge, however hard, I'm not in this by myself. I'm in this together with others. And so my job is to find those others of the willing, those others of the lean in, those others of the, I would call lifelong learners, those others that are aligned with my heart space, right? And then how do we interpret that, again, to be explicit in our intentions and then iterative in our findings? And I think that's what I'll leave you with.
Thank you so much. Such a great conversation. I know that we could go for quite a while with that, but I do want to give opportunity to just briefly touch on the resources found on the Harmony website. If you're unfamiliar, check out harmony-academy.org for you to capture those resources, as well as continuing the learning through our Harmony Professional Learning Portal. If you want to take a screenshot or grab those QR codes, these both are on-demand training, professional learning opportunities with modules that you can take at any time, and they give you a certificate when you are finished with them. So they're worth the while. I've done building relationships with students, and Be the Spark is next on my radar. So please take advantage of that. And then we also wanted to make you aware of some things that are coming soon. And I'm very excited that Dr. Susan Green from New York City Public Schools will be joining our very own Dr. Nick Yoder in some conversations around SEL and academic integration in the intersections. So mark your calendar for that, as well as March 26th. We will be having another webinar around reading, and I'm excited to see where that goes with Dr. Doug Fisher, Demetrius Davenport, and Sasha Ortega. And last but not least, we want you to join us in San Diego for Here Comes the Sun. This is our ASU GSV Summit that will be coming later on this spring. Thank you so much for your attentiveness, your participation, and just the time that you've given us this afternoon. We certainly appreciate you, and we look forward to seeing you the next time.
Thank you.
Kamilah. Thank you, Schneider.
Thank you.
Nice to hear you, Emily, if not see you.
Oh, I'm here. Is Ben still there?
I think so.
Yep, I'm here. So that wraps us up. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Recordings will be sent out. Great job, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks.
Take care. Bye.